Picture this. A man born into chains, forbidden to read, denied even ownership of his own name, somehow architects the destruction of three of the most powerful military forces on earth. He writes a constitution that permanently abolishes slavery, while European philosophers are still debating whether black people have souls. He transforms from a plantation coachman into a military genius who makes Napoleon Bonaparte's generals look like amateurs. And he does all of this without a single day of formal education or military training. This is the story of Toussaint Louverture. And here's the question that haunted historians for 2 centuries. How does someone with absolutely nothing, not even freedom, not only defeat the greatest empires of his age, but fundamentally rewrite what's possible for human beings? Stay until the end. The answer reveals a strategy for transformation that works whether you're fighting literal slavery or the invisible chains that hold you back right now. Let me take you back to 1743, to a place called Saint-Domingue. You know it today as Haiti. Back then, it was the most profitable colony in human history and simultaneously the closest thing to hell on earth. The French had turned this Caribbean island into a sugar machine, and the fuel for that machine was human bodies, African bodies, worked to death in the cane fields under a sun that could kill you just as surely as the overseer's whip. The numbers tell you everything. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person on a Saint-Domingue plantation was 7 years after arrival. 7 years. The plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work people to death and buy new slaves than to keep them alive. Saint-Domingue produced more wealth than all 13 American colonies combined. Sugar, coffee, indigo, cotton. Ships left the harbor loaded with goods that would make French merchants rich beyond imagination. And every ounce of that wealth was extracted from human suffering on a scale that's hard to comprehend. There were about 500,000 enslaved people on the island by the 1780s, 30,000 white colonists, and 28,000 free people of color who occupied a strange middle ground, some of them wealthy plantation owners themselves, but always subject to discriminatory laws that reminded them they weren't really free either. Into this nightmare, a boy was born. His parents gave him the name Toussaint, but the plantation owners called him Toussaint Breda after the plantation that owned him, because that's what he was in their eyes. Property. An asset on a balance sheet. His parents were both African-born, brought across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships. His father, Gao Guino, was from the Alada region of what's now Benin. Some historians believe he may have been a minor chief before his capture. What we do know is that he passed something crucial to his son, a sense of dignity, a belief that their current condition wasn't natural or permanent. The Breda plantation at Haut-du-Cap, where Toussaint was born, was one of the larger operations in the northern province. Hundreds of enslaved people working thousands of acres of sugarcane. The work was backbreaking. Cutting cane in tropical heat, feeding it into mills that could crush your hand as easily as the stalks, boiling the juice in massive cauldrons that could scald you to death if you slipped. But young Toussaint caught someone's attention. Maybe it was his intelligence, maybe it was his work ethic, maybe it was just luck, but somehow he got promoted from the fields to a position as a coachman. Coachmen worked closer to the main house. They drove the plantation owners to social events, to church, to visit other plantations. They weren't breaking their backs in the cane fields 14 hours a day. They had slightly more access to information, to the world beyond the plantation. They heard conversations. They saw how the colonial elite lived and thought and operated. And Toussaint paid attention to everything. He learned how to read people, how to be present but invisible, the way enslaved people had to be around white colonists, how to listen without seeming to listen, how to remember everything he heard. He also learned about horses, how to care for them, how to handle them, how to read their moods and needs. This might seem like a small thing, but it wasn't. Cavalry would become crucial in the wars to come, and Toussaint's understanding of horses would give him an advantage that more formally trained military commanders lacked. But Toussaint didn't stop there. He kept rising. from coachman to steward, managing the entire plantation operation for his owner, the Comte de Noé. Think about that for a second. The enslaved man was so competent, so brilliant at organization and management, that his owner trusted him to run one of the most productive plantations in the entire colony. As steward, Toussaint oversaw everything: the work schedules, the distribution of supplies, the coordination between different parts of the plantation operation. He became intimately familiar with how the whole system worked, from the economics of sugar production to the logistics of managing hundreds of people to the weak points where the system could break down. The Comte de Noé was, by the standards of the time, considered a relatively humane master. He didn't use the whip as freely as some plantation owners. He allowed his enslaved workers small garden plots. He permitted marriages and tried to keep families together, though of course he could separate them at any time if he chose. But humane slavery is still slavery. Toussaint understood this. No matter how well he was treated relative to others, he was still property. His wife was property. His children were property. Everything could be taken away at any moment. And yet, the Comte de Noé's relative leniency created an opportunity. Because in that slightly less brutal environment, Toussaint could do something that would transform his life and ultimately change history. He could learn. There was a man on the plantation named Pierre Baptiste. He was Toussaint's godfather, a carpenter and gatekeeper, and Pierre Baptiste could read. In a world designed to keep enslaved people ignorant, Pierre Baptiste committed what the plantation owners would have considered a dangerous crime. He taught Toussaint to read and write. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Stolen moments, hidden lessons, the constant risk of discovery. Because literacy wasn't just knowledge, it was power. It was dangerous. An enslaved person who could read could forge travel passes, could read about revolutions happening in other parts of the world, could access ideas that the plantation owners desperately wanted to keep away from enslaved people, could begin to imagine a different future. So the lessons had to be secret. Late at night, perhaps after the day's work was done, or in brief moments when overseers weren't watching, Pierre Baptiste teaching Toussaint his letters, then words, then sentences, opening up a whole world that was supposed to be forbidden to him. And Toussaint didn't just learn to read, he became obsessed with learning. He taught himself everything he could get his hands on. Somehow, despite being enslaved, despite having no formal access to education, he found books. Maybe through the plantation manager, Baron de Libertar, who noticed Toussaint's intellectual abilities and was impressed enough to lend him books. Maybe through connections with free people of color who had access to libraries. But he found them, and he devoured them. Military strategy. He studied the campaigns of Julius Caesar, reading about how Roman legions conquered vast territories through discipline and tactical innovation. He read about Alexander the Great's use of combined arms tactics. He studied the art of fortification and siege warfare. Philosophy. He read the Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau's Social Contract, with its arguments about the rights of man. The Abbé Raynal's History of the Two Indies, which contained a passage predicting that a great leader would arise among enslaved people to lead them to freedom. Toussaint would later cite this passage, suggesting he saw himself as the fulfillment of that prophecy. History. He learned about other revolutions, other uprisings, other moments when the oppressed had risen against their oppressors. He studied what had worked and what had failed. Religion. Toussaint was Catholic, educated in the faith by Jesuit missionaries who worked in the colony. But his Catholicism was complex, blended with African spiritual traditions and shaped by his experience of slavery. He saw in Christianity a message of universal human dignity that contradicted everything the slave system represented. By his late 30s, Toussaint had achieved something remarkable within the constraints of slavery. Around 1776, he gained his freedom, though we don't know exactly how. Some historians believe Baron de Libertar freed him. Others think he may have been able to purchase his freedom with money he'd saved. But we know that by the early 1780s, Toussaint was a free man. He married a woman named Suzanne Simone Baptiste in 1782. She was a remarkable woman in her own right, described by those who knew her as fiercely loyal, intelligent, and deeply in love with Toussaint. Suzanne had a son from a previous relationship, Placide, whom Toussaint adopted and raised as his own. Together, Toussaint and Suzanne had two biological sons, Isaac and Saint-Jean. Toussaint was devoted to his family, and he was determined that his sons would have the education he'd had to fight for. He sent Isaac and Placide to France to be educated. Think about that. A former slave, a black man in a colony built on racial hierarchy, sending his sons to be educated in Paris alongside the children of French aristocrats. It was almost unheard of. As a free man, Toussaint even acquired some property. He leased a small coffee plantation and had a few enslaved workers of his own. This troubles some people when they learn about it. How could a man who'd been enslaved himself own slaves? But we have to understand the context. In Saint-Domingue, property ownership, including ownership of enslaved people, was one of the few ways a free black man could gain any economic security or social standing. The system was designed so that you either owned or were owned. There was no comfortable middle ground. By 1791, Toussaint had built a life. He was free, he had a family he loved, he had some property and economic security. He was nearly 50 years old, which was old for that time and place. He could have stayed out of what was about to happen. But here's the thing about Toussaint. He wasn't content with personal freedom while hundreds of thousands remained in chains, and the world was about to give him an opportunity to do something about it. The French Revolution had begun in 1789. News traveled slowly to the colonies, but when it arrived, it electrified everyone. The revolutionaries in Paris were talking about liberty, equality, fraternity. They were talking about the rights of man. But they weren't talking about enslaved people. Not at first. The French revolutionaries needed the wealth that Saint-Domingue produced, so they talked about rights for white colonists and eventually for free people of color, but slavery itself. That was too profitable to question. The free people of color in Saint-Domingue saw an opportunity. They petitioned for equal rights with white colonists. The white colonists responded with violence. They weren't about to share power with people they considered inferior. And the enslaved people watched all of this. They saw the free people of color fighting for rights. They saw the white colonists fighting to maintain their privileges. They saw the French revolutionaries talking about liberty while depending on slave labor. And they started to organize. August 14, 1791. Deep in the forests near Morne Rouge, something happened that would shake the entire Western world. Over 200 enslaved leaders gathered for a ceremony. A voodoo ceremony led by a priest named Duty Boukman and a priestess named Cécile Fatiman. This wasn't spontaneous. This was the result of months of careful planning. 200 leaders from plantations across the region, coordinating, strategizing, preparing for revolution. The ceremony at Bois Cayman, as it came to be known, was both spiritual and strategic. Vodou wasn't just religion in Saint-Domingue, it was resistance. It was a way of maintaining African identity and community in a system designed to strip both away. It was a communication network that the white colonists couldn't penetrate or control. Boukman delivered a prayer that night. The exact words have been debated by historians, but the message was clear. The God of the oppressors wasn't their God. Their God demanded freedom. Their God demanded justice. A pig was sacrificed. The leaders drank its blood, binding themselves to the cause. And then they dispersed back to their plantations to wait for the signal. August 22, 1791. The signal came. That night, the plantations began to burn. Enslaved people rose up across the northern province. They set fire to the cane fields, to the sugar mills, to the great houses where the plantation owners lived. They killed overseers and owners who'd brutalized them for years. They destroyed the machinery of slavery with a fury that had been building for generations. Within weeks, hundreds of plantations were destroyed. Thousands of white colonists were dead or fleeing to Le Cap, the colonial capital, seeking protection. The most profitable colony in the world was in flames. The Haitian Revolution had begun, and it would become the only successful slave revolt in human history. But in August 1791, Toussaint was almost 50 years old. He was free. He had a family. He could have stayed out of it. Instead, he made a choice that would define the rest of his life. But he didn't rush in immediately. Toussaint wasn't impulsive. He was strategic. He spent the first weeks of the revolution helping his former master, the Comte de Noailles, and the manager Bayon de Libertar escape to safety. Why would he do that? Some historians see it as evidence of loyalty or gratitude, but I think it was more calculated than that. Toussaint was already thinking several moves ahead. He was building a reputation as someone who kept his word, who honored obligations, who could be trusted. That reputation would serve him well in the complex political and military maneuvering to come. Only after he'd fulfilled what he saw as his obligations did Toussaint join the revolution. And when he did, he didn't join as just another soldier. He joined as a doctor. That's right. His first role in the revolution was as a physician to the troops. He'd learned herbal medicine, probably from his father and other African-born enslaved people who'd brought that knowledge with them. But he was also learning, watching, studying how the rebel armies were organized, what tactics they were using, where they were succeeding, and where they were failing. The early rebel armies were chaotic, brave, yes, motivated, absolutely, but disorganized. They'd attack in massive waves, overwhelming through sheer numbers, but taking terrible casualties. They had few weapons beyond machetes and farming tools. Toussaint saw all of this, and he started to organize. Within months, he'd formed his own unit. Small at first, maybe a few hundred men, but disciplined in a way that other rebel units weren't. He drilled them, taught them to follow orders, organized them into companies with clear chains of command. He also armed them better. He raided plantations for weapons. He captured guns from colonial militias. He established workshops to repair and maintain equipment. He created supply lines to keep his troops fed and equipped. And he started winning. Not big dramatic victories at first, small engagements, ambushes, raids, but he won consistently. His troops took fewer casualties than other units. They captured more supplies. They held territory. Other rebel leaders noticed. This former coachman, this middle-aged man who'd joined the revolution late, was demonstrating a genius for warfare that none of them possessed. By 1793, Toussaint had become one of the most important military leaders in the revolution, and the situation was getting more complicated by the day. The Spanish controlled the eastern part of the island, Saint-Domingue. They saw an opportunity to weaken the French and expand their territory, so they offered to support the enslaved rebels. They provided weapons, supplies, and military training. Toussaint joined the Spanish forces. He was commissioned as an officer in the Spanish army, given the title of Don and command of a significant force. But he wasn't loyal to Spain. He was loyal to one thing: ending slavery. And he was learning. The Spanish gave him access to formal military training, to European tactics and strategy. He absorbed it all, combined it with the guerrilla warfare tactics that worked so well in Saint-Domingue's mountains and forests, and created something new. He also started building his reputation. He was known for discipline. His troops didn't rape or pillage the way some rebel armies did. He enforced strict codes of conduct. He treated prisoners humanely. He kept his word when he made agreements. This wasn't just morality, it was strategy. Toussaint understood that the revolution needed legitimacy. If they were going to create a new nation, they had to prove they could govern, that they weren't just a mob of former slaves bent on revenge. But the Spanish had no intention of actually abolishing slavery. They were using the rebels for their own colonial games, planning to restore slavery once the French were defeated. Toussaint saw through this. And when the French revolutionary government in Paris, under pressure from abolitionists, finally abolished slavery in all French territories in February 1794, Toussaint made his move. On May 6, 1794, he switched sides. He took his forces, now numbering in the thousands, and joined the French Republicans. The Spanish, who thought they had a useful ally, suddenly found themselves facing one of the most dangerous military minds of the age. And Toussaint wasn't just fighting the Spanish now. The British had invaded Saint-Domingue in 1793, seeing an opportunity to seize the profitable colony while France was distracted by revolution at home. They sent thousands of troops, planning to restore slavery and add Saint-Domingue to their Caribbean empire. So now Toussaint was fighting a war on multiple fronts. Against the Spanish in the east, against the British in the west and south, against French colonists who wanted to restore slavery, against other rebel leaders who didn't trust his alliance with Republican France. He should have been crushed. He was outnumbered, outgunned. His soldiers were former slaves, many of them still learning to fight. They faced professional European armies with centuries of military tradition, the best weapons, and unlimited resources. But Toussaint had something those professional armies didn't have. He had motivation. His soldiers were fighting for their freedom, for their families, for their very right to exist as human beings. And he had genius. Toussaint rarely fought conventional battles where European armies had the advantage. Instead, he used mobility, terrain, and surprise. He struck where the enemy was weak and disappeared before they could respond. He also understood psychological warfare. He spread rumors about his forces being larger than they were. He used spies and informants to gather intelligence about enemy movements. He negotiated with enemy commanders, sometimes to make genuine agreements, sometimes just to buy time or sow confusion. And he understood logistics. Wars aren't just won by brave soldiers. They're won by armies that are fed, equipped, and paid. Toussaint established supply lines. He organized workshops to repair weapons and equipment. He created a system for distributing food and supplies to his troops. The British learned all of this the hard way. They sent wave after wave of troops to Saint-Domingue, thousands of soldiers, millions of pounds in military spending. British soldiers died in battle, yes, but more died of yellow fever and other tropical diseases. The Europeans had no immunity to these diseases. They'd land in Saint-Domingue healthy and be dead within weeks. Toussaint understood this. He knew that time was on his side. The longer he could keep the British engaged, the more they'd lose to disease. So he avoided decisive battles. He harassed them. He made them chase him through swamps and jungles where yellow fever thrived. By 1798, the British had lost over 15,000 soldiers in Saint-Domingue. They'd spent millions of pounds. They'd gained nothing. They gave up and withdrew, signing a secret agreement with Toussaint that they'd leave if he promised not to export the revolution to other British colonies. Think about that. The British Empire, the most powerful military force on earth, negotiating with a former slave, agreeing to his terms, defeated by an army of former slaves led by a man who learned strategy from books he read in secret. But Toussaint wasn't done. He turned his attention to the Spanish in the eastern part of the island. The Spanish had been weakened by their war with France and by internal conflicts in Santo Domingo. Toussaint saw an opportunity. In January 1801, he invaded Santo Domingo. The Spanish governor tried to resist, but his forces were no match for Toussaint's battle-hardened army. Within weeks, Toussaint had conquered the entire eastern part of the island. For the first time in its history, the island was unified under a single government, and that government was led by a former slave. 3 European empires, Spain, Britain, and France, all of them had tried to control Saint-Domingue. All of them had failed to stop Toussaint. By May 1801, Toussaint Louverture, the former slave who wasn't supposed to be able to read, named himself Governor-General for life. If this story of revolutionary leadership and military genius inspires you, share it to help others discover what's possible when you refuse to accept the limitations others place on you. But here's what makes Toussaint's story even more remarkable. He wasn't just a military genius, he was a state builder. He understood that winning the war was only the beginning. Now he had to create something that could last. On July 7, 1801, Toussaint promulgated a constitution, his constitution, and it was revolutionary in ways that went far beyond just abolishing slavery. Article 3 stated something that had never been written into law anywhere in the Americas. There cannot exist slaves on this territory. Servitude is therein forever abolished. All men are born, live, and die, free and French, forever, not temporarily, not conditionally, forever. But the Constitution did more than that. It established religious freedom. It created a system of public education. It guaranteed property rights. It established an independent judiciary. It created a framework for representative government, though with Toussaint as Governor General for life. But Toussaint's constitution was complicated, and we need to talk about that complexity because it tells us something important about the impossible situation he was navigating. He didn't just abolish slavery and let everyone do whatever they wanted. He created what he called the cultivator system. Former slaves were tied to the plantations where they'd been enslaved, required to work, though now as paid laborers rather than property. They received a quarter of the plantation's profits. They couldn't be bought or sold. They couldn't be whipped or physically punished. They had legal rights and could take plantation owners to court. But they also couldn't leave the plantations without permission. A lot of people, both then and now, criticized this. It looked too much like slavery with a different name. But here's what Toussaint understood. Saint-Domingue's entire economy was based on sugar production. The plantations were the only source of wealth, the only way to generate the money needed to pay for an army, to build schools and roads, to run a government. If the plantations collapsed completely, the colony would have no way to sustain itself, no way to defend itself, no way to prove to the world that black people could govern themselves. The European powers were watching, waiting for the experiment to fail so they could justify re-enslaving everyone. Toussaint was trying to thread an impossible needle. Maintain freedom, maintain productivity, maintain order, prove that a society of former slaves could function, all while surrounded by hostile powers that wanted to see him fail. Was the cultivator system perfect? No. Was it better than slavery? Absolutely. Was it the best Toussaint could do given the circumstances? That's the question historians still debate. But here's what we know for certain. Under Toussaint's leadership, Saint-Domingue began to function again. The plantations produced sugar and coffee. Trade resumed with the United States and Britain. The government collected taxes and paid its soldiers. Toussaint established schools. He built roads and repaired infrastructure. He established courts and a legal system. He negotiated trade agreements with other nations. He created a functioning government with ministries and departments and bureaucracies. He did all the things that the so-called civilized world claimed black people were incapable of doing, and the civilized world hated him for it, especially Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was building an empire. He'd conquered most of Europe. He'd crowned himself Emperor of France. He had visions of a French empire in the Americas that would rival anything the British or Spanish had built. And Saint-Domingue, the most profitable colony in the world before the revolution, was supposed to be the jewel in that empire. But there was a problem, a former slave named Toussaint Louverture, who refused to bow to anyone. Napoleon looked at Toussaint's constitution and saw rebellion. Toussaint had declared himself Governor General for life without asking Napoleon's permission. He'd given himself the power to reject French laws. He'd essentially made Saint-Domingue independent in everything but name. And Napoleon couldn't allow that. Not just because of Saint-Domingue itself, but because of what it represented. If enslaved people in one colony could free themselves and govern successfully, enslaved people in other colonies might get ideas. Napoleon made a decision. Toussaint had to go. And if that meant re-enslaving hundreds of thousands of people, so be it. In December 1801, Napoleon assembled an invasion force, 40,000 troops under the command of his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, the largest military expedition France had ever sent to the Americas. The fleet arrived in Saint-Domingue in February 1802. 86 ships carrying an army that had conquered much of Europe. Toussaint knew they were coming. His spies had warned him. When the French fleet appeared, Toussaint gave an order that shocked everyone. Burn the cities, destroy the ports, leave nothing the French can use. His generals hesitated. These were the cities they'd fought to liberate, but Toussaint understood something his generals didn't yet grasp. The French were coming to restore slavery. If they succeeded, everything would be lost anyway. Better to deny them the resources they needed and fight from the mountains. Le Cap burned. Port-au-Prince burned. The French landed to find smoking ruins instead of the prosperous cities they'd expected. And then Toussaint's forces retreated into the interior, into the mountains and forests where they had every advantage. Leclerc found himself in the same situation the British had faced. He controlled the coasts, but the interior belonged to Toussaint. His troops were dying of yellow fever. His supply lines were constantly harassed. But Leclerc had learned from the British mistakes. He brought more troops. He was willing to be patient. And he had a weapon that Toussaint couldn't defend against: treachery. Leclerc started making offers to Toussaint's generals. Surrender, and you'll keep your rank in the French army. Betray Toussaint, and you'll be rewarded with land, money, position. Some of them took the deal. Henri Christophe, one of Toussaint's most trusted commanders, surrendered in April 1802. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, another key general, followed soon after. Toussaint found himself increasingly isolated. His forces were still fighting, but the French were gaining ground. More of his generals were defecting. And Leclerc made an offer: peace negotiations, a chance to end the bloodshed, guarantees of safety and respect. Toussaint could retire to one of his plantations and live out his life in peace. It was a lie. Toussaint knew it might be a lie, but he was running out of options. His army was fragmenting, the French were getting stronger, and Leclerc was promising that slavery would not be restored. In May 1802, Toussaint agreed to lay down his arms. He retired to one of his plantations, trying to live quietly. For a few weeks it seemed like it might work, but Leclerc was just waiting for the right moment. In June 1802, Toussaint received an invitation. General Brunet, one of Leclerc's commanders, wanted to meet to discuss some administrative matters. Just a friendly conversation. Toussaint went to the meeting. When he arrived, French soldiers surrounded him. They arrested him on the spot. No charges, no trial, just betrayal. They put him in chains, the same chains he'd spent his life fighting against. They separated him from his family. His wife Suzanne and his sons were deported to different parts of France, deliberately kept apart. And Toussaint himself was sent to the coldest, most remote prison the French could find. Fort de Joux, high in the Jura Mountains on the border between France and Switzerland, a fortress built into a cliff face where winter temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. They put Toussaint in a cell, 6 feet by 8 feet, stone walls, a tiny window, no heat, no visitors, no contact with the outside world. The jailers took his watch, his money, everything he had. They gave him minimal food. They refused to provide warm clothing or blankets adequate for the mountain winter. Napoleon refused to grant him a hearing, refused to even acknowledge him as a political prisoner. Toussaint wrote letters to Napoleon, to the French government, asking for a trial, asking to see his family, asking for basic human treatment. The letters were ignored. For 7 months, Toussaint sat in that freezing cell. The man who had commanded armies, who had written constitutions, who had defeated empires, was left to die slowly of cold and starvation and neglect. He wrote one final letter before he died. In it he said something that would prove prophetic. In overthrowing me, you have cut down in Saint-Domingue only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are numerous and deep. On April 7th, 1803, his jailers found him dead. He was sitting in his chair, his head resting on the fireplace. He'd frozen to death. He was 59 years old. He died never knowing whether his revolution would survive. But here's what Napoleon didn't understand. You can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea whose time has come. Back in Saint-Domingue, the revolution didn't end with Toussaint's capture. It intensified. Because Leclerc made a fatal mistake. Despite his promises, he started re-enslaving people. He brought back the whip, the chains, all the horrors that Toussaint had abolished, and the people of Saint-Domingue said no. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint's lieutenant who had surrendered to the French, realized he'd been betrayed. The French weren't interested in peace or partnership. They wanted slavery restored. Dessalines took command of the revolutionary forces, and Dessalines wasn't interested in negotiating with France or maintaining ties to the empire. He wanted complete independence, total freedom, no compromise. The war that followed was brutal. Dessalines fought with a fury that terrified the French. The French were already weakened. Yellow fever had killed Leclerc himself in November 1802. Thousands of French soldiers were dead from disease. In November 1803, at the Battle of Vertières, Dessalines defeated the French army decisively. It was over. The French evacuated. The survivors limped back to France, defeated by the people they'd tried to re-enslave. On January 1st, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines stood before the people of Saint-Domingue and declared independence. He gave the nation a new name, taking it from the indigenous Taino people who had lived there before Columbus destroyed them: Haiti. Haiti became the first independent black nation in world history, the first post-colonial independent country in Latin America, the second independent nation in the Americas after the United States. And it happened because a coachman who wasn't supposed to be able to read taught himself military strategy and decided that freedom was worth dying for. Now, Toussaint's personal story ended in that frozen prison cell, but his legacy was just beginning. Think about what his revolution meant. For the first time in history, enslaved people had risen up and won. Not just won a battle, not just gained some concessions. They had defeated the most powerful empires on earth and established their own nation. Every enslaved person in the Americas heard about Haiti. Every plantation owner feared it, because Haiti proved something that the entire system of slavery depended on people not believing. It proved that enslaved people could fight, could win, could govern themselves. The United States and European powers tried to strangle Haiti economically. They refused to recognize it diplomatically for decades. France demanded that Haiti pay reparations for the loss of French property, including the enslaved people who'd freed themselves. Haiti paid that debt for over a century, crippling its economy. They spread propaganda claiming Haiti was chaos and savagery. They pointed to every problem Haiti faced as proof that black people couldn't govern themselves, conveniently ignoring that they were actively working to make Haiti fail, because they couldn't allow the example to spread. But the example did spread. Haiti inspired slave revolts throughout the Americas, the German Coast Uprising in Louisiana in 1811, Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831, countless smaller acts of resistance. It inspired abolitionists. Frederick Douglass, the great American abolitionist who himself escaped from slavery, wrote about Toussaint with reverence. He saw in Toussaint's story proof that black people were capable of anything white people could do, if only given the chance. The poet William Wordsworth wrote a sonnet about Toussaint, calling him one of the most remarkable men of the age. Abolitionists across Europe and America invoked his name in their campaigns. Even Napoleon, who had sent Toussaint to die in prison, allegedly said on his own deathbed that his greatest mistake was trying to restore slavery in Saint-Domingue. Now let's come back to that question I asked at the beginning. Remember that question about how someone with absolutely nothing, not even freedom, defeats the greatest empires of his age and fundamentally rewrites what's possible for human beings? Here's the answer, and it's not what you might expect. Toussaint didn't succeed because he was superhuman. He succeeded because he understood something that his enemies didn't. He understood that the system that oppressed him had also taught him everything he needed to destroy it. Think about it. As a plantation steward, he learned organization and management. He learned how plantations operated, how the colonial economy worked, where the weak points were. His enslavers thought they were just using his intelligence to make themselves richer. They didn't realize they were training the man who would burn their world down. When he taught himself to read, he didn't just learn words. He learned strategy from military texts. He learned about revolutions in other parts of the world. He learned that the system that seemed permanent and unchangeable had been built by human beings and could be destroyed by human beings. When he worked as a coachman traveling between plantations, he built networks. He learned the geography of the island. He understood the terrain that would later become his greatest weapon against professional armies. Every skill he developed while enslaved became a weapon for liberation. But there's something deeper. Toussaint understood that freedom isn't just about breaking chains. It's about building something better in their place. A lot of revolutionary leaders are great at destruction, but terrible at construction. Ideological war to prove that black people could govern themselves. And he was doing all of this while trying to hold together a coalition of people who had very different visions of what freedom meant. Was he perfect? No. The cultivator system was controversial. He could be ruthless with his enemies. He made political compromises that some people saw as betrayals. But he was navigating an impossible situation. He was trying to create something that had never existed before, a nation of free black people in a world that believed black people couldn't be free. And even though he died in prison, even though he never saw the final victory, he won. His revolution succeeded. His vision of a free Haiti became reality, because transformation isn't just about one person, it's about creating something bigger than yourself, something that can survive even after you're gone. Toussaint planted seeds that grew into a nation. He inspired people who inspired other people. He proved something that changed history. He proved that the most oppressed people on earth could defeat the most powerful empires. That literacy and learning could be weapons more powerful than guns. That strategic thinking and careful planning could overcome overwhelming force. That it was possible to build something new and better from the ashes of an evil system. And here's why this matters right now, in your life, today. You might not be fighting literal slavery, but you're fighting something. Maybe it's poverty, maybe it's lack of education, maybe it's discrimination, maybe it's just the voice in your head that says you're not good enough, you don't have what it takes, people like you don't succeed. Toussaint's story tells you that voice is lying. He had every reason to give up, every reason to accept his limitations, every reason to believe that the system was too big, too powerful, too permanent to change. But he didn't accept it. He learned, he planned, he built alliances, he developed skills, he waited for his moment, and when that moment came, he was ready. You don't need permission to transform your life. You don't need perfect circumstances. You don't need advantages or privileges or lucky breaks. You need to do what Toussaint did. Learn everything you can. Develop skills that others underestimate. Understand the systems that constrain you so well that you can see their weak points. Be patient. Be strategic. And when your moment comes, be ready to act with everything you've got. Toussaint went from enslaved coachman to the man who defeated 3 empires and created a nation. Not because he was born special, not because he had advantages, but because he refused to accept the limitations others placed on him, and he was willing to do whatever it took to break free. The question isn't whether transformation is possible. Toussaint proved it's possible. The question is whether you're willing to do what it takes. Toussaint Louverture died in a freezing prison cell, alone and forgotten by the empire that feared him. But his name echoes through history. His revolution changed the world. His example still inspires people 2 centuries later. That's the power of transformation. That's what happens when you refuse to stay in the box others built for you. So, here's my challenge to you. What's your plantation? What's the system that's trying to keep you enslaved? What are the chains you need to break? And more importantly, what are you learning right now that will become your weapon later? What skills are you developing? What networks are you building? Because your moment is coming. The question is whether you'll be ready when it arrives. Share your thoughts below. Tell me what limitations you're refusing to accept. Tell me what you're learning that others don't think you need to know. Tell me how you're preparing for your moment. Because transformation isn't just possible, it's inevitable for those who refuse to accept anything less. Toussaint Louverture proved that, and you can prove it too.